Nice to see you all here. So there's three things which I want to base this talk around today. The first bit is around a slight innovation in language, in how we talk about doing programmatic. The second thing is around a significant innovation in the technology and what are the implications of that. And then the third thing is, now that we have this new type of language, a new technological innovation, what does that mean from a strategic perspective for us marketeers? So they're the three main things which I want to talk about over the next 10, 15 minutes or so. Before all of that, I think it's customary, though, to actually have some sort of mention of rocket science in a programmatic presentation. I don't have any, but I thought this story is what I wanted to share to try and reflect the message which I'm trying to put across, which came to the first innovation in language. Now, this is a story which was really gobsmacking, and it's actually true. It's not just a made-up thing. So back in the day, September 1999, NASA made this spaceship. They threw it into space. They tried to control it, and it drifted off into space, and they couldn't get the machine to be controlled, and they lost it. Bad situation to be in. $125 million. Some of the world's greatest minds, they made this machine, and it drifted off into space, and literally they'd lost control of it. Now, they went back and reversed through the process of how they actually figured out where this problem lied. And the problem was actually quite interesting, that they had two different groups of scientists, rocket scientists, sorry. One of them used one measurement system, and another one used a different measurement system. And they weren't talking to each other using the same measurement system. That was the cause of the error. When they tried to engage with two different parts of the machine in navigation, because the two different measurement systems had been used, it couldn't calibrate, they couldn't control it, and it drifted off into space. Now, I bet you're wondering, what am I doing talking to you guys about rocket scientists, as you probably do in most programmatic conversations when rocket scientists are mentioned. But the reason why I wanted to talk about that is because of this simple thought around innovation in language and the challenges which we face today in the programmatic era, and the potential challenges we would continue to face in the programmable era as well, if we don't address the challenge of language. Now, what you look at is on the thinking side of things as marketeers. Before any of this new lingo, programmatic, programmable, before the internet, before any of this stuff, the marketeer always had a challenge to think about where they need to position the brand, what message they want the brand to put across, who they want to have that message communicated to, what sort of time would they like to communicate that message, and where would they like to allocate that budget. And these are the things they would think about when it comes to a brand challenge or a brand opportunity. You know, how do we increase sales? How do we position our brand at a certain point in time? It's moment marketing. So that's the thinking element, and this is the language of thinking. You then skip across to when programmatic became mainstream, and you get all this stuff which doesn't really make that much sense unless you know what it means. And it's not really helpful in terms of bridging the gap between how we naturally think about programmatic and how we then technically deliver it. Words like, which I'm sure we're familiar with, DSP, DMP, algorithms, rocket sciences, tech stacks, QBS, doublespeak things. Now, I think this is a bit of a challenge in the programmable era and the programmatic era as well. There's a disconnect between the language used on thinking and how that specifically translates into the language of doing. So this is where we want to start in terms of our subtle innovation in terms of language. We want to try and relabel the elements of the machine to make sense to marketeers. The machine isn't going to change. It's just the labels which we place onto the different bits of the machine, which we can change, which is something which we start our story with. So what we start and where we start is we have the original type of language. There are many more acronyms. You know, header bidding was a recent one which popped up. They're important to understand, and it's critical as practitioners that we understand that. But in terms when it comes to marketeers and thinking about brands, we want to shift into a unified language, such that when we think about how we want to position a brand, who the audience is, where we want to position it, where we would like to deliver the message, what message would we like to deliver, how would we like to deliver that message, when do we want to deliver the message. These are more common human words, I guess, to help us understand how to position the brand in whatever makes sense, or the objective is for the brand. So this is a point that we're going to move away from this type of language to something which makes more sense. Fundamental component parts, which aren't complex. It's not new language to any of us. We're all familiar with all of these words, and all we're doing here is subtly changing the labels we put onto programmatic execution. Who, where, what, how, and when. Simple words which make sense to all of us, even in the programmatic time era and the programmable era. So this is the first message I want to put across, a subtle change in how we think of the technical execution side for things which make sense, which we're all familiar with, irrespective of what era we exist in. So that's the first point. Now, a little bit more detail on what I'm actually talking about here before we move on to the second point with the technical innovation is what sort of things do we mean by who? It could be customers, it can be non-customers. We can look at behaviors which are exerted or demonstrated. We can look at interests, we can have demographic attributes. Where, who's the publisher, who's the media owner, which is important to us. Location, channel, mobile, video, display, social. What message do we want to communicate? What sort of creative? Is it rich media? Has it got dynamic elements to it? How much do we want to allocate our budget to these different to the elements of the campaign? Is it a high amount of budget at a various stage? Is it a medium? Is it low? Is it a high bid strategy? And then when time is a single variable, but you can cut it in different ways. You can look at it across hour, minutes, seconds, concepts around the big burst of being on air, concepts around take it off market. But essentially, these are all elements which we as marketeers have known about. Maybe dynamic is something a bit new, but in essence, this is a sort of a language and a framework which makes sense to us as marketeers. We can relabel the machine with these labels, which then makes it make sense for us. Now, the reason why I think this is important as a first part of the presentation is because if we have used this language in the doing section, how do we actually plan a programmatic campaign? And we use this language in the thinking section, how do we want to position a brand, whether it's for a brand purpose or performance perspective? What you actually have is one unified language. There's no misunderstanding. There's no instance of a NASA spaceship drifting off into space. The thinking can directly be translated into the doing. So this is the sort of the first piece. It's not groundbreaking, admittedly. It's a small, subtle change. It's kind of taking the post-its off of a DSP and sticking on things which make sense to us as marketeers. But it's a change which is important, which we build on in the next section. So the Rio 2016, super excited. Going to be a lot of interesting stuff going on over there. And I want to talk about how we've taken this subtle change of language and now how can we put that to practical use with the innovation with that app nexus of the APB bidder. So we took this language and we thought, how can we take advantage of this language for the Rio 2016 Olympics? So what I want to do is have a bit of a challenge, okay? Now, for a minute or so, the time it takes me to get some water, maybe, what I'd like you to do is, given everything which you know currently, the language which you're familiar with, the technological systems which could deliver that campaign, and your strategic thinking, if you piece those three things together, how would you as marketeers create a campaign for a brand to have play a part in the 100-meter sprint? Okay? So take a minute and think about how you would approach that, given current technologies and current language which is available. What would a typical plan look like? So take 30 seconds, chat amongst yourselves, feel free. I'm going to grab some water and have a little think. Okay, all right, that was a quick 30 seconds, so I'm just going to try and bring it back down again, guys. So what I want to do is talk you through how we approach this situation and get into some details around how we've got this new simple language which makes sense to all of us. It's not hugely innovative, but it's a simple language and useful nonetheless. How we took this framework and how we then plugged it into the APB bidding architecture, the big technological innovation, to create new strategic opportunity for one of our big brands, specifically around the 100-meter sprint. Now, let's walk through this step by step using the actual technology. We're not going to talk about technology. We're not going to talk about bid rates or DSPs or tech stacks. We're not going to have any of this lingo. We're going to have language which has made sense to us since the very beginning. And we're going to base it around this event. Now, what you see on the left-hand side are the different component parts which I mentioned, who the audience is, where you would like to show your message, whether that's physical or digital, what you would like to show them, the creative message, how much would you like to pay for that message, what your budget allocation is, and when would you like to show that message. These are the 5 component parts. In themselves, they're not complex, but what I hope comes across in the next section is the beauty comes from the complexity of how they're built upon, what you can potentially construct, which is very different from what our opportunity was before this technical innovation. So let's start walking through using this framework. So this is one part of one of the trees which we've built out. So let's start with where, which is important. So in this instance, it is based in London and in Rio. So these are the 2 elements within the decision tree node, which are important to the brand and to us strategically. Now, these are the core elements which a machine wouldn't necessarily be able to tell us now or in the near future. This is the role which we as planners and strategists and marketeers really play in how we can build out this type of architecture. So we start, for some reason, London and Rio are 2 important pieces in the actual campaign brief. So we use the where elements. The next component parts are who is important to us as a brand. Now, this was one element which came out of a workshop session with the clients. Now, we used where, and what you can see is there's different rationales and methodologies on how we've cut up the different groupings of where. So you can see on the board, there's 2 different groups, sports fans in Rio, and then in London, there's 2 different distinct groups, people who have got no interest in sport, and then a segment who are specifically interested in running. Now, the segment of usefulness for the brand has a past purchase cycle, purchase history of the consumer, where they've spent less than £50 and also more than £50. So you can start to see how we're taking these really simple words, which you're all familiar with, and we're starting to bring them to color inside a decision tree-based architecture, which is the strategy the client wants to take in how to position the brand in that moment within the Olympics. So these are the different ways we've cut up the audience. We then move on to when. So again, in this instance, there were 3 really key moments which the client wanted to focus on, which were important to the brand. Now, the 3 moments are in Rio, because it's in the right time zone. Europe is asleep still, I think. In Rio, the brand was really excited about being able to deliver their content to the audience when a TV ad was on show. So using TV Sync, that was an important initiative they wanted to use. You then have a further level of interest for the brands, which is where the customer spends more than £50, but the time elements here are a build-up to the actual event and then during the actual event as well. So you can see here what we've done is we've taken the simple language of when, and we've made it make sense for the brand strategically without having to get into the specific technical terminology of what the machine actually does, because we've changed the labels from things which don't really make much sense to marketeers to things which make sense to marketeers. Your final piece, second to final piece, is then how. So now we look at our budget and we look at our bid levels. So what's important to us, what's the value to us as a brand in that moment varies. We build on the earlier parts of the tree, and then we make our decisions around fluctuations in bids to the different segments, the different times and different locations which are important. And the final element of the tree is then what message we actually show. So based on where you sit within that tree, who you are, where you are, budget allocation and the time dictates and informs the actual creative message delivery to that consumer group. Now, hopefully, all of your answers in your 10-second chat is something similar to that. But the reason why I wanted to build through this story of how we approach this is because by a simple change of language on the machine, which I keep referring to, and also taking advantage and plugging that into the innovation within the APB, what you then have is a seamless connection between how you think about how you want to position a brand, where it might be, and how you actually do that physically. So it's a one seamless language, and then taking that language, you can plug it into this architecture to create a strategic approach to that moment within the Olympics, which is something physically impossible when it comes to traditional ways of thinking and planning media. You are stuck on line-by-line methodologies, and you are not able to build an architecture like this. So this is our case study, really, of how to use this strategically to take advantage of all the best bits. Now, one thing which was really insightful was the actual workshop session. Now, we ran this session to get to that small output over a day, and it was really interesting to see how the dynamic only deepened between the clients and the agency. And we whiteboarded many 8,000 in total variations of how we want the brand to have a voice within the Olympics. I only showed you one corner. It's difficult with current technology in PowerPoint to show you the whole tree, but the guys have done a great job of trying to pull out each of the trees to visualize those 8,000 elements within the tree of how the brand wants to play its part in those moments based on what those different trigger points when they actually happen. So they've done a visualization, they've taken the actual one corner of the tree, and then they've pulled out all instances of the tree, what you can see here. And this is how the brand is actually going to be playing its part within the Olympics. And that's a story which I wanted to share with all of you today. So on closing remarks, the three things I really wanted to get clear and across to you guys is the change of language, a subtle change, making it make sense, removing the complexity from the doing component part, which allows us as marketeers to operate in Programmable. It gives us great opportunity to be creative on things which we just simply couldn't have done before. We didn't have the language. We had the language to do it, but we didn't have the technology to deliver it. And I get super excited on what the potential future looks like, building on everything which we've talked about today, and building out strategic frameworks, which I've talked you through. And with that, thank you very much for your time.